Imagine sitting by your window having breakfast, watching a grey morning sky, and 6 hours later, the house around you no longer stands. On the morning of September 7th, 2024, Super Typhoon Yagi made landfall on Hainan Island, China, then continued barreling directly toward the northern coast of Vietnam. Wind gusts reached 195 kilometers per hour, the equivalent of a Formula One car at full racing speed. And that wall of wind was slamming directly into every home, every bridge, every person standing outdoors. Yagi was the most powerful typhoon to make landfall in Vietnam in 30 years, and the most intense tropical cyclone recorded anywhere in Asia throughout the entirety of 2024. But the most extraordinary thing was not its strength, it was the speed. Because Yagi nearly doubled in intensity within just 24 hours, and even the world's most advanced weather forecasting models failed to keep up. So how does a storm explode in power so fast that modern science cannot keep pace? And what exactly happened when it touched the Vietnamese coastline on that morning? The Gulf of Tonkin is one of Southeast Asia's warmest bodies of water during summer months, with sea surface temperatures ranging from 30 to 31 degrees Celsius, warm enough to fuel and amplify any storm system that crosses it. Northern Vietnam's geography creates exceptional vulnerability, a coastline stretching more than 300 kilometers like an open target facing the sea, and behind it, the flat, wide-open Red River Delta, with nothing standing in the wind's way. Haiphong, Vietnam's third-largest port city, with over 2 million residents, sits directly at the mouth of the Gulf in a location where typhoon strikes are not an exception but an inevitability that has repeated throughout history. But Yagi in 2024 was unlike anything the people here had ever witnessed, because it began as an ordinary tropical depression in the Pacific and transformed into something else entirely within just 3 days. When Yagi crossed the Philippines in early September, it was still a Category 1 storm, but upon entering the South China Sea and encountering an unusually warm water layer extending 70 meters deep, it began drawing energy like a massive atmospheric pump. Rapid intensification is defined as a storm, strengthening by at least 35 kilometers per hour within just 24 hours. And Yagi did not merely reach that threshold, but exceeded it by nearly double. On Hainan Island in China, where Yagi made its first landfall, winds reached 160 kilometers per hour. Trees were uprooted, rooftops peeled away like paper, and more than 5 million people were forced to evacuate. The alarming part was that after crossing Hainan, instead of weakening, as most storms typically do after passing over land, Yagi re-entered the warm sea and continued to strengthen. In Hanoi, more than 100 kilometers from the coast, people were still out shopping that evening. Sidewalk cafes were still full, and children were still playing in the alleyways. The Vietnamese government issued warnings and ordered the evacuation of more than 1 million people along the coast, a scale of pre-storm mobilization unprecedented in the country's history of disaster preparedness. Thousands of fishermen were ordered to bring their boats to shore, and over 46,000 vessels were safely anchored, but those caught too far at sea had to face waves reaching the height of a 4-story building. In the northern mountain provinces, rain had already been falling for 3 days before the storm arrived. The soil was saturated and trembling, and the mountain slopes of Lao Chai, Yen Bai, and Hajiang were like vessels being filled to their absolute limit. Hmong and Dao, ethnic minority communities in hillside villages, had lived through dozens of storm seasons and knew every sign of rain. But this time, the rain showed no sign of stopping. Inside the meteorological centers in Hanoi, weather radar screens were displaying images that specialists there had never encountered in their careers. A dense red and purple spiral bearing down directly on the coastline. The night before landfall, the sky along the Quang Ninh coast turned an eerie green, a phenomenon that occurs when light refracts through the dense storm cloud layers saturated with moisture and ice crystals far above. Atmospheric pressure was falling at a terrifying rate, dropping to 931 millibars at the storm's center, nearly 9% below normal, enough for human ears to physically register the change. And then, at 6:20 in the morning of September 7th, the eye of the storm touched the coast of Quang Ninh, and everything that had been building for weeks, months, even decades, began to release within a matter of hours. The first winds hitting the shore sounded unlike anything the coastal residents of Quang Ninh had ever heard, not the familiar roar of an ordinary storm, but a continuous piercing tone like a jet engine on approach that simply never stopped. Within the first hour, winds ripped the roofs off thousands of homes across Quang Ninh, corrugated metal sheets flying through the air like enormous blades, embedding into concrete walls, severing power lines, and shattering windows. Trees lining the boulevards of Haiphong City were uprooted en masse. Banyan and hopa trees that had stood for 20 and 30 years, collapsing within minutes, crushing motorcycles, cars, and the entrances to buildings. Picture it this way. If every street tree in Hanoi's Hoan Kiem district fell to the ground simultaneously, you would begin to grasp the scale of what was happening across Haiphong City that morning. Storm surge from Haiphong Bay rose and poured into coastal residential areas, gray-brown seawater breaching the sea walls, pushing boats up onto the roadway surface, overturning motorcycles, and carrying away everything that was not secured. This was not ordinary sea level rise. This was three forces combining simultaneously. Extremely low atmospheric pressure pulling water upward, powerful winds pushing water toward shore, and the tide already at its monthly peak. At Haiphong Port, one of Vietnam's largest container terminals, dozens of massive gantry cranes stood exposed to the wind like towers without sails and began to tilt under wind forces equivalent to tens of tons of lateral pressure. Two port cranes collapsed entirely, massive steel structures weighing hundreds of tons, crumpling like children's toys, destroying dozens of containers and paralyzing the port's operations for weeks to follow. Consider what happens when Vietnam's third largest port shuts down for weeks. Not just delayed cargo, but the entire northern supply chain breaking apart at once, with no alternative route for hundreds of thousands of containers. Simultaneously, across the coastal provinces, the power grid began collapsing in sections. Electricity poles snapping like matchsticks, transformer stations shorting and burning, and more than 3 million households losing power simultaneously. In that city of over 2 million people, with no electricity and no communication signal, hundreds of thousands of residents began sheltering in darkness, listening to the wind screaming outside and not knowing when it would end. At 8 in the morning, the eye of the storm was directly over the land between Quang Ninh and Haiphong. And this was the strangest moment those sheltering in the zone described, because suddenly everything stopped. The eye, the storm's quiet central zone, measured approximately 60 kilometers across, and for roughly 20 to 30 minutes, the sky was blue. The wind ceased, and birds began singing again over streets filled with wreckage. This is the most dangerous moment that scientists specifically warn about, because many people believed the storm had passed and stepped outside, precisely when the back half of the typhoon, often more violent than the leading half, was about to arrive. And precisely as predicted, when the back half of Yagi struck, the winds reversed completely in direction, and whatever had survived the first assault now had to endure the same force, attacking from the opposite side. Structures already half weakened by the first wind direction now had no capacity to resist further. Cracked walls collapsed completely, bent bridges broke entirely, and roofs that had partially survived the first assault were fully stripped in the second. Meanwhile, in the northern mountains, rain from Yagi was falling, as though the sky was attempting to empty an entire ocean, with total rainfall at some locations in Lao Chai and Yen Bai exceeding 400 millimeters within just 24 hours. What does 400 millimeters in 24 hours actually mean? It is the amount of rainfall Hanoi receives on average over nearly 2 full months of its rainy season, poured onto steep mountain terrain within a single day. The soil had been saturated for 3 days already, and now had no capacity to absorb a single additional drop. So every new millimeter of rain began flowing directly over the surface, finding its way downward by gravity. And that was when the true horror began. Not at the coastline anymore, but deep inside the valleys, and on the mountain slopes hundreds of kilometers from the sea. The Red River at Lao Cai rose more than 10 meters above its normal level, transforming a gentle river into a massive brown-red monster flowing at terrifying velocity, carrying trees, vehicles, and entire intact houses downstream. Phong Hai Bridge, spanning the Red River in Baothang District, a reinforced concrete structure weighing thousands of tons, was lifted and swept away entirely by the floodwaters as though it had never existed. A reinforced concrete bridge swept away entirely. Pause on that for a moment, because it means the water was generating a force greater than the combined weight of the entire bridge structure, plus the frictional resistance of its foundations in the riverbed. At this moment, on the mountain slopes of Van Yen district in Yenbai province, the earth began to move in a different way, not rising from below like floodwaters, but cascading from above and faster than anything a person could outrun. Flash floods and landslides are two entirely different mechanisms, but equally devastating in their consequences. Flash floods approach from valley bottoms at motorcycle speed, while landslides arrive from above at the speed of a truck, accelerating down a steep incline. At Lang Nu village in Phuc Khan Commune, Bao Yen district, Lao Cai province, a massive body of earth and rock on the slopes above began sliding at dawn on September 7th, and in less than 2 minutes, it had reached where the community was living. The Lang Nu landslide mass is estimated to have contained more than 500,000 cubic meters of earth and rock, equivalent to more than 300 Olympic swimming pools combined, all moving downhill at over 30 kilometers per hour. This is the moment when numbers alone can no longer carry the full weight of what happened, because Lang Nu was a Tay ethnic community of over 200 people, and within less than 2 minutes, that village ceased to exist on any map. At the same time, in Bakha and Sima Kai, districts of Lao Cai, dozens of other landslides occurred almost simultaneously, severing every road into mountain villages and turning them into isolated islands impossible to reach from the outside. In Yenbai, the Thao River rose to record levels, reaching a historical high not recorded in 40 years, submerging entire downstream areas, including dozens of communes and thousands of homes. In Hanoi, though far from the storm's center, winds still reached level 12 to 13, and thousands of trees along major boulevards, including Wien Chi Than, Lang Ha, and Kim Ma, fell and blocked roads, crushing houses and vehicles. More than 40,000 urban trees in Hanoi fell during Typhoon Yagi, nearly equivalent to the total street tree count on all inner-city roads, and Hanoi lost something that would take 10 to 20 years to replant and restore. But while Hanoi was counting fallen trees, in the more distant mountain areas, the situation was becoming darker with every passing hour, and rescue agencies were having to make choices that no one ever wants to face. Dozens of villages in Lao Chai and Yenbai were completely isolated, roads blocked, suspension bridges washed away, and mobile phone signals cut off by collapsed transmission towers, meaning no one outside knew what was happening inside. The Vietnam People's Army mobilized dozens of helicopters, but the heavy rain and low cloud over the mountain terrain made flying into the narrow valleys extremely dangerous, forcing pilots to navigate by memory and instinct alone. At Lang Nu, when the first rescue teams finally reached the site by road, after hours of digging through the landslide debris, blocking the approach. What they found was a flat, brown valley floor, with no sign that anyone had ever lived there. Meanwhile, the Red River at Hanoi had exceeded warning level 3 for the first time in many years, and low-lying areas along the embankments in outer districts began to flood, as the dike system faced pressure unlike anything it had experienced in recent memory. The Red River dike system in Hanoi, built and reinforced over centuries, is Vietnam's largest hydraulic infrastructure with a total length of over 2,000 kilometers, and it held but only by a very narrow margin of safety. If that dike system had failed, the entire inner city of Hanoi would have been submerged under 4 to 6 meters of water, equivalent to all of Hoan Kiem, Ba Ding, Dong Da, and Hai Ba Trung districts disappearing underwater as deep as a 2-story building. In the mountain provinces, the picture continued to darken. In Mukang Chai, district of Yen Bai, famous for terraced rice fields, described as one of Asia's agricultural wonders, thousands of hectares of terraces were obliterated by landslides. In Khao Bang, flooding from the Bang River submerged the entire city, with water reaching the second floor of many buildings, and thousands of residents climbed to their rooftops to await rescue in the unrelenting rain. Meanwhile, along mountain highways such as National Road 4D from Lao Chai to Sapa, hundreds of landslide points had turned the road into a sequence of impassable craters and earthen walls impossible to cross without heavy machinery. Sapa, northern Vietnam's most visited highland town, attracting over 3 million visitors annually, was completely isolated for several days, with no electricity, no telephone connection, and no usable road in or out. The flooding and landslides in the northern mountain provinces were not a side effect of Typhoon Yagi, but a second disaster, entirely independent in character, with a scale equal to and possibly exceeding the first disaster at the coast. By September 12th, 5 days after landfall, over 200 people had been confirmed dead and over 100 remained missing, with Lang Nu village alone accounting for the largest single share of those numbers. Total preliminary economic damage from Typhoon Yagi to Vietnam was estimated to exceed $9 billion, equivalent to approximately 2% of the country's entire annual gross domestic product. 2% of GDP is the amount Vietnam would need to build dozens of provincial hospitals, hundreds of schools, or the entire infrastructure of a brand new province, and it disappeared in less than 48 hours. More than 160,000 homes were damaged or completely destroyed across northern Vietnam, a number of houses equivalent to the entire residential stock of a city the size of Tai Nguyen or Nam Dinh being erased from the map. More than 300,000 hectares of rice and crops were flooded and damaged, an agricultural area larger than the entire province of Vinh Phuc, carrying with it not just the income of millions of farmers, but the entire autumn harvest food supply. At sea, hundreds of fishing vessels that could not reach shore in time sank or were lost, and the fishing communities of Quang Ninh lost not just their livelihoods, but the only tools they had for earning them. And at this moment, as the storm dissipated and floodwaters began partially receding from the lowlands, millions of people stepped out of shelter and faced the question that no one can ever truly prepare an answer for. Where do you even begin? In Quang Ninh, electricity workers began continuous around-the-clock operations to restore the power grid. But with over 17,000 electricity poles broken and hundreds of transformer stations damaged, it was an enormous undertaking. The military, deploying tens of thousands of soldiers, was mobilized to support search, rescue, and debris clearance, and images of soldiers digging through debris with bare hands in Lao Chai became the defining image of the entire response effort. In Lao Chai, rescue teams used acoustic detection devices and search dogs to locate people beneath meters of compacted mud, under terrain conditions where the ground itself was still unstable and the risk of secondary landslides remained significant. Meanwhile, in Hanoi, millions of volunteers began donating essential supplies, drinking water, and food, and convoys of charitable vehicles began the journey toward the mountains as soon as roads were partially cleared. This speaks to what disaster researchers call social resilience, the capacity of a community to self-organize and respond without waiting for formal structures, and the Vietnamese people demonstrated that, at a national scale, 8 days after the storm, electricity had been restored to over 90% of affected households, a record recovery speed for Vietnam's power grid following a disaster. But in the most remote villages, the darkness continued. At Lang Nu, after weeks of searching, rescue teams had recovered dozens of victims, but many others remained deep beneath the debris, and ultimately, the active search had to be suspended because the terrain was simply too dangerous to continue. Along the Quang Ninh coast, communities began counting what had been lost. More than 3,000 fishing and aquaculture vessels damaged or sunk, hundreds of kilometers of transport infrastructure destroyed, and an entire season of aquaculture production wiped out completely. Typhoon Yagi did not just destroy physical things, but erased years of accumulated savings for many families. Fishing boats, worth hundreds of millions of dong, purchased with borrowed money, now lying at the bottom of the sea, while the debt that bought them remained. But the larger scientific question that researchers were asking was not why Yagi caused so much damage, but why Yagi intensified so rapidly, and whether this is something we are going to see with increasing frequency. Sea surface temperatures in the South China Sea and Gulf of Tonkin are rising at a rate faster than the global average, and this is the most fundamental fuel that tropical cyclones require to maintain and increase their intensity. Satellite data shows that the rate of rapid intensification events among tropical cyclones across the Western Pacific has increased significantly over the past 30 years, and Yagi is the clearest and most recent example of that trend. When the sun rose over the Quang Ninh coast on the second day after the storm, the first light fell on a landscape that those who had been born and raised there could no longer recognize. The landscape of Ha Long Bay, one of the world's most recognized natural heritage sites, was largely unaffected. The limestone karst formations, millions of years old, still standing silent and unchanged, while everything humans had built around them was transformed. In the lowlands, as floodwaters receded, they left behind a layer of mud, 5 to 15 centimeters thick, coating every surface, from house floors to road surfaces, from rice paddies to schoolyards, mud that had a smell and would take weeks to fully clear. In the mountain regions, the floodwaters permanently altered river channels at many locations. Bends that had curved for hundreds of years were straightened by force. Familiar sandbars disappeared, and new rock formations emerged from formerly submerged riverbeds. More than 3,000 schools across the northern provinces were damaged, and millions of students were out of school for several weeks, with some children in the most remote areas losing an entire semester because their schools were completely destroyed by landslides. Survivors from Lang Nu were relocated to temporary resettlement areas, beginning new lives in unfamiliar places. And for many weeks, those first weeks, many struggled to accept the reality that the village they had known their entire lives no longer existed. Economic damage to Quang Ninh province alone was estimated to exceed 23,000 billion dong, over $900 million, equivalent to the province's entire development investment budget for nearly 2 years, erased in a single night. The international community responded quickly, with many countries and organizations sending humanitarian aid, but the scale of the disaster was large enough that even the most concentrated international assistance could only meet a small fraction of the actual need. 1 month after the storm, electricity had returned almost everywhere. Major roads had been reopened, and coastal cities had begun cleanup and reconstruction. But in the mountains, many villages remained in a state of ongoing crisis. Typhoon Yagi exposed a reality that urban planners knew, but few spoke openly about. Tens of thousands of homes in Vietnam's coastal and mountain areas were built without adequate typhoon-resistant standards, and that is precisely why they collapsed. Notably, homes built to typhoon-resistant standards, with properly connected reinforced concrete columns and beams, survived even in level 16 winds, while homes built to inadequate standards collapsed under level 12 winds. In the mountains, the story was more complex. It was not the building materials, but the location that was the determining factor, because villages built at the base of steep slopes with shallow soils were by their very nature always at risk of landslide. Finally, after weeks of search and rescue operations, the total death and missing toll from Typhoon Yagi and its consequences exceeded 800 people, with the majority dying not from the storm winds themselves, but from landslides and flash floods in the mountain regions. Among those 800 people, none died for lack of warning, because warnings had been widely issued. But many died because landslides cannot yet be predicted to individual specific locations, and that represents the current boundary of science. Transport infrastructure damage was estimated at over 14,000 billion dong, with hundreds of kilometers of national and provincial highways severely damaged and some mountain routes requiring complete reconstruction from the ground up. The headwater protection forest ecosystem was severely damaged, with thousands of hectares of natural and planted forest wiped out by floods and landslides, increasing the risk of floods and landslides for all future rainy seasons to come. Yagi ended as every typhoon ends, gradually dissipating as it moved inland and encountered terrain that sapped its energy. But what it left behind did not dissipate, and the most important question was no longer what had happened, but what would happen next. In the weeks following Typhoon Yagi, the Vietnamese government announced plans to relocate more than 115,000 households away from high-risk landslide and flash flood zones across the country, the largest resettlement program in the nation's history. Typhoon Yagi also accelerated the expansion of landslide and flash flood monitoring sensor networks across the northern mountain provinces, because one of the most painful lessons was that early warning systems at the individual village level were far too weak. At the regional level, Yagi sparked an important discussion about disaster management cooperation among Southeast Asian nations. Because typhoons do not recognize national boundaries, and the most effective early warning systems are those that are shared. Climate scientists have pointed out that while climate change does not create more storms, it is making the most intense storms stronger, faster, and more dangerous as they carry more moisture and encounter warmer oceans. Hanoi, Manila, Bangkok, Ho Chi Minh City, Jakarta, and dozens of other coastal cities across Southeast Asia are all facing similar or higher levels of risk in the coming decades, as rising sea levels combine with more intense storms. What Yagi demonstrated once again is that in disaster preparedness, nothing matters more than advanced preparation. Because in the first 6 hours of a super typhoon, no technology in existence can save you if you have not already prepared before it arrives. But preparation also has its limits, because no community in the world can fully prepare for a Category 16 typhoon, combined with simultaneous flash floods and landslides, and that is why the location where people live matters just as much as the quality of the homes they live in. The question Vietnamese policymakers must answer is not only how to rebuild what was lost, but how to build differently, in different places, to different standards, for a future that may contain more Yagis to come. One thing that Yagi could not destroy was memory. The memory of those who lost loved ones, the memory of fishermen who lost their boats, and the memory of the children of Lang Nu, whose entire birth village now lies deep beneath the mud. And this is what disaster science always reminds us. Disasters are not the end of stories. They are chapters, and the way a society reads those chapters, learns from them, and changes its behavior because of them will determine what the next chapter contains. Typhoon Yagi did not happen because nature became more violent. It happened because oceans are becoming warmer, because people are living ever closer to dangerous places, and because warning systems are still not strong enough in the places that need them most. 6 hours. That was all the time Yagi needed to pass through and alter the lives of millions of people. But the consequences of those 6 hours are and will continue to shape northern Vietnam for decades to come, and the question is no longer whether the next storm will arrive, but when.